One night in 330 BC, a drunk man made a decision that erased the most sophisticated civilization on Earth. He picked up a torch. His companions followed. And by morning, the greatest palace complex in the ancient world, a building that had taken 200 years and the labor of workers from 23 nations to construct, was a field of ash and collapsed columns. History remembers that man as Alexander the Great. It calls what he did a military triumph. But here is what history consistently fails to mention. What burned that night was not just a building. What burned was the royal archive of a 200-year empire, the Zoroastrian sacred texts, the administrative records of a state that had governed half the known world with a sophistication no civilization would match for another 1,000 years. The word we use for that kind of destruction today is a war crime. In 330 BC, the Greeks called it a victory celebration. And for 2,300 years, the Greeks have been the ones writing the history. What Persia really looked like before that torch was lit, that story has been waiting to be told. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what was built. And to understand what was built, you have to go back further than most history books are willing to go. Between the 20th and 15th centuries before Christ, nomadic tribes began descending from the steppes of Central Asia onto a vast, punishing plateau ringed by mountain ranges and cut through with salt deserts so hostile that entire armies have simply vanished inside them. These were the people who would become the Persians. They did not arrive into a vacuum. They arrived into the remnants of Elam, one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, with its own writing system, its own urban architecture, its own diplomatic tradition. What happened next was not conquest. It was fusion. The incoming nomads and the ancient Elamites slowly merged, languages, bloodlines, agricultural techniques, mythologies, into something that was neither purely one nor the other. Geography does that to people. When the land is hard enough, it burns away everything that is not essential and leaves behind only what is strong enough to survive. Persia was not born in a palace. It was forged in a desert. And then, from that desert, came a man who changed the definition of what a king was supposed to be. In 559 BC, Cyrus II, whom history would call Cyrus the Great, inherited a minor Persian kingdom in the southwestern highlands and proceeded, within 30 years, to build the largest empire the world had ever seen. But the numbers are not the point. Every conqueror in history has impressive numbers. What made Cyrus singular was the philosophy. When he conquered Babylon in 539 BC, the most powerful city in the world at that moment, he did not enslave its population, demolish its temples, or impose Persian religion on its people. He walked into the city of Marduk and made offerings to Marduk. He freed the Jews who had been held in captivity there for decades and funded the rebuilding of their temple in Jerusalem. He issued a declaration, inscribed on a clay cylinder, that guaranteed every people in his empire the right to worship their own gods, speak their own languages, and maintain their own customs. That cylinder sits in the United Nations building in New York today. It is regarded as the first human rights document in recorded history. Cyrus did not just build an empire. He invented a new way of imagining what empire could mean. And then he built Persepolis. The word means city of the Persians, but that translation undersells it almost insultingly. Persepolis was not a city in any ordinary sense. It was an argument made in stone, a deliberate, architecturally precise declaration of what the Persian Empire believed about itself and about the world. Construction began under Darius I around 518 BC and continued for generations. What rose from the plateau was a complex of interconnected palaces, ceremonial staircases, columned halls, and gateways so vast that delegations from 23 different nations are depicted on its walls, each one shown in their own traditional clothing, carrying their own regional gifts, walking in dignified procession toward the Persian king. Not as conquered subjects, as participants. The Gate of All Nations announced in 3 languages that all peoples were welcome here. The Hall of 100 Columns could seat 10,000 people under a single roof. And the Apadana staircase, its carved reliefs still sharp enough today to read like a photograph, showed Persians and Medes standing side by side as equals, neither subordinated to the other. This was not architecture. This was ideology, cut into limestone and built to last forever. At its absolute peak under Darius I, the Achaemenid Empire stretched from the shores of Libya in the west to the Indus River in the east, from the Black Sea in the north to the Arabian Sea in the south. Historians estimate that somewhere between 40 and 50 million people lived within its borders, roughly half the total human population of the Earth at that time. No empire before it had come close, and holding that empire together required something far more sophisticated than military force. Darius divided the empire into 20 administrative regions called satrapies, each governed by a regional administrator accountable to the central court. He standardized weights and measures across the entire territory. He minted a gold coin, the Daric, accepted in markets from Egypt to Afghanistan. And he built the Royal Road, 2,700 kilometers of maintained highway stretching from Sardis on the Aegean coast to Susa in the Persian heartland, equipped with relay stations every 25 kilometers where fresh horses and riders waited. A message sent from one end of the empire arrived at the other end within 7 days. In the 5th century BC, the Royal Road was not a road. It was the ancient world's postal internet. But walk away from the palace complex and down into the living city, and what you would have encountered would have astonished you in ways that the grand architecture could not. The markets of Persepolis and the surrounding imperial centers were genuinely international in a way that would feel familiar today. Indian spices moved alongside Egyptian linen. Lydian metalwork sat next to Babylonian textiles. The imperial bureaucracy operated in multiple languages simultaneously. Clay tablets from Persepolis record transactions written in Elamite, Aramaic, and Old Persian on the same administrative day. And those tablets reveal something that modern historians are still absorbing. The workers who built Persepolis, the stonecutters, the carpenters, the painters, were paid wages. Documented, recorded wages. They received food rations, wine rations, and beer rations calibrated to the difficulty of their work. Female workers received the same rations as male workers for equivalent labor. Women who had recently given birth received additional rations. All of it recorded on clay tablets that survived in the palace treasury for 2,500 years, waiting for archaeologists to read them. A maternity benefits system. In 500 BC, the Persian Empire did not just build monuments, it built institutions. And underneath all of it ran an ideology that most people have encountered without ever knowing its source. Long before Christianity, long before Islam, even before the final form of Judaism as we know it today, the Persians were Zoroastrians. And Zoroastrianism was not simply a religion in the modern sense of the word. It was a complete cosmological operating system, a framework for understanding time, morality, history, and the ultimate destiny of the universe. Its founder, Zarathustra, taught that the cosmos was engaged in a total, uncompromising war between Ahura Mazda, the god of light, truth, and order, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of darkness, deception, and chaos. The time was not circular but linear, moving from creation toward an inevitable final judgment. That human beings had free will and bore moral responsibility for which side they chose. That the dead would be resurrected and judged. That the world would ultimately be purified and evil permanently destroyed. When Cyrus liberated the Jews from Babylon, he brought them into 2 centuries of intimate contact with this tradition. Jewish theology absorbed the concepts of linear time, final judgment, resurrection, and the cosmic battle between good and evil directly from Zoroastrian Persia. Those concepts then flowed into Christianity, then into Islam. Every time someone speaks of heaven and hell, of the end of days, of the final judgment, they are thinking in categories that a Persian prophet named Zarathustra mapped out 3,000 years ago. But there is one part of the Persian story that the historical record has almost completely erased, and that erasure was not accidental. The clay tablets of Persepolis, the same ones that documented worker wages, also document something the Greek historians never mentioned once. Persian women owned property. They managed estates, ran businesses, supervised large workforces, and traveled across the empire under official documentation that guaranteed their rite of passage. The tablets record women in supervisory roles, receiving higher rations than the men working beneath them. Female members of the royal household led expeditions, commanded resources, and appear in the administrative record exercising autonomous decision-making authority. None of this appears in Herodotus. None of it appears in Aeschylus. None of it appears in any Greek source that shaped the Western world's understanding of Persia. Because the people who wrote the history were the people Persia was trying to control, and they had every reason to present Persian civilization as barbaric, despotic, and primitive. The victors write the history. The Persians lost the narrative long before they lost the war. And about that war, everything the Western world thinks it knows about the Persian Wars, the 300 Spartans, the Battle of Marathon, the naval engagement at Salamis, comes from Greek sources written by Greek authors for Greek audiences in the aftermath of a Greek military victory. From the Persian perspective, the campaigns into Greece were not an existential civilizational crusade. They were border security operations on the western fringe of a 50 million person empire. The Greek city-states that resisted represented a marginal territorial irritant to a state that simultaneously administered Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, and the Indus Valley. Losing at Marathon was, for the Achaemenid Empire, approximately what losing a skirmish in a distant province feels like to a modern superpower. Inconvenient, embarrassing, not existential. The narrative of plucky Greek democracy triumphing over Persian tyranny is the ancient world's most successful propaganda campaign. It was written by the winners, taught by their intellectual descendants, and has shaped Western self-understanding for 2.5 millennia. Persia never got to write its version. Its archives burned. The cracks, when they appeared from inside. They always do. The succession after Darius was not clean. Xerxes inherited an empire that was already straining at its administrative seams, too vast, too diverse, too dependent on the personal authority of an exceptional central ruler to run smoothly under anyone merely competent. The satrap system, brilliant under a strong king, began generating independent power centers under weaker ones. Regional governors collected taxes, maintained armies, and made foreign policy decisions without meaningful oversight from the center. Court intrigue metastasized. Xerxes was assassinated by his own courtiers. His successors faced the same fate. The empire that had been built on the radical principle that many peoples could coexist under a single, tolerant administration began to discover the structural cost of that tolerance. It required a king strong enough to hold the center, and the center was increasingly empty. The palace at Persepolis grew more elaborate. The empire it represented grew more hollow. It is the oldest story in the history of power, and Persia, for all its genius, could not escape it. In 330 BC, Alexander of Macedon marched into Persepolis with an army that had already dismantled the Persian military in 3 decisive engagements. The city surrendered. Alexander, by multiple accounts, initially intended to spare the palace complex. What changed that intention was a banquet, a considerable amount of wine, and, according to some ancient sources, a Greek courtesan named Thais, who reminded the assembled company that burning the palace of the Persian kings would be fitting revenge for the Persian burning of Athens 150 years earlier. Whether that account is true or legendary matters less than what happened next. The torches went up. The cedar roof beams caught. The columns cracked in the heat and fell. By morning, the Apadana was a ruin. The throne room was ash. The royal archive, generations of administrative records, diplomatic correspondence, religious texts, the accumulated documentary memory of the greatest empire the ancient world had produced, was gone. Alexander, reportedly, wept when he saw what the fire had done. He had not meant it to go that far. History rarely does. And yet, the fire destroyed the building. It did not destroy the civilization. Persian administrative systems were so superior to anything Alexander had developed that his successors, the Seleucids, adopted them wholesale within a generation. The Persian language did not retreat. It advanced, surviving the Greek period, surviving the Arab conquest, surviving the Mongol invasions, emerging on the other side of every catastrophe still intact. The Zoroastrian moral framework had already embedded itself so deeply in Jewish theology that no conqueror could extract it. Persepolis, as a physical place, was gone. Persian civilization simply relocated into language, into religious tradition, into the administrative DNA of every empire that came after. You cannot burn an idea that has already colonized the minds of 100 successor cultures. Persia understood, perhaps better than any civilization in history, that the most durable form of power is not military. It is cultural. And culture does not require a building to survive. That survival is still visible if you know where to look. The word paradise comes directly from the Old Persian paradiesa, a walled garden, the Persian aristocracy's highest expression of beauty and order brought to nature. Every time someone describes an ideal place as paradise, they are borrowing a word from a civilization that burned in 330 BC. The concept of human rights, the foundational idea that individuals possess dignity that no state may violate, enters Western political tradition most directly through the Cyrus Cylinder, now displayed at the United Nations as a symbol of that tradition's origin. The moral architecture of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, linear time, final judgment, the cosmic struggle between good and evil, the resurrection of the dead, carries the fingerprints of Zoroastrian Persia on every surface. 3 billion people today organize their understanding of existence around concepts that a Persian prophet articulated 3 millennia ago. Persia did not just influence the ancient world. It installed the firmware on which 3 of the world's great religions still run. And here is the paradox that 2,300 years have not resolved. Alexander burned Persepolis, and history made him great. Persia built the first human rights document, the first maternity benefit system, the first truly multicultural empire, and the moral framework inside 3 world religions. And history made it the villain in a story about 300 Spartans. 2 narratives, one ancient world, and a gap of comprehension between them that says less about Persia than it says about who has been allowed to tell the story. The empire that was destroyed in a single night took 3 millennia to fully understand, and we are still not finished. Some civilizations leave behind ruins. Persia left behind the ideas inside your head. It just never got to sign its name to them.